Okay, so you're here with us on the deep dive because I'm guessing you like to get right into it.
Yes, straight to the core.
Right, like you want the knowledge,
Like
the
you.
fundamentals without having to wade through, piles of jargon and complex stuff.
Cut to the chase.
Exactly.
That's it.
Yeah, so you're the learner, and that's who we're talking to today. And
Right.
we're really going deep on something that's so important today.
Really foundational.
Yeah, it really is, and that's research design.
Research design.
Specifically for business studies.
Exactly.
So we're going to be using some really sharp insights from Bergenholtz and his colleagues.
Some really, really great material.
Yeah, it is good stuff.
To really give us those building blocks of how good research is structured.
Yeah.
But also, crucially, I think, how to spot those weaknesses.
Yeah, because there's a lot of bad research out there.
There is a lot, yeah.
So much research coming at us from all angles.
Absolutely, and we need to be able to filter that.
Yeah.
And this is going to help us do that.
Yes, it will. So consider this like your shortcut.
I like that, a shortcut.
To understanding how to structure good research.
Yeah.
And how to spot the bad.
And how to know when to ignore something.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Okay, so where do we start with all of this?
Well, I mean, maybe it's good to just sort of lay out what we're working with today.
Yeah, good idea.
We've got these academic course materials, and they're really focused on how researchers use frameworks for their work.
Yeah.
Right, so these are the blueprints.
Blueprints, yeah.
For how they're going to actually do the research.
Right.
But they also talk a lot about where people tend to hit those roadblocks.
Yeah, and this is great because it's not just for researchers. Like we were just saying, anyone can benefit from this.
Absolutely.
If you're reading reports, if you're seeing news articles.
If you're trying to make sense of the world.
Exactly.
You're going to benefit from this.
Okay, so what's our main objective with this deep dive today?
So I think our goal is pretty straightforward. We really just want to make sure that you, as the listener, you have a clear understanding of the main approaches that researchers use to research design.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at the different approaches to the different designs.
Okay.
But we also want to understand the typical challenges that come up.
Yeah.
Because we all know that research is never perfect.
Never perfect.
And so by the end of this, you should be much more informed.
Yeah.
When you are looking at some research.
Absolutely. And able to be a bit more critical.
Critical, yeah.
About what you're seeing.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just sort of unpack the basics here for a minute.
Okay. Yeah.
What exactly is research design?
That's a good question because it's one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah, and people might have an intuitive sense of it.
Right.
But might not be able to really say what it is.
Yeah, and it's actually really simple at its core.
Okay.
Research design is basically the master plan.
Okay.
It's the comprehensive framework for how you're going to collect and analyze data.
Right.
And then the goal of that is to answer your research question.
Right. It all comes back to that question.
Exactly. So think of it like the strategic architecture.
The architecture.
Of your entire research study.
Okay.
So that's what research design is.
Okay. So something that's important that you mention is that there's a sequence.
There is, yeah.
Like it happens in a certain order.
Right.
So where does it fall in that order?
Yeah, so it's not the first thing you do.
Right.
The first thing you do is you define your research question.
Yeah.
What is it you want to know?
Right.
Once you know what you want to know, then you move on to the research design.
Okay.
That's the next step.
So it comes after you define the research question, but before you start doing things like gathering data and analyzing data.
Exactly. Before you even touch the data.
Okay.
You have to have the design in place.
Yeah. This makes me think of like planning a building.
Okay. Yeah.
Like you said, it's the architecture. So it's like before you go and get the materials, you have to decide what you're building.
Exactly. And this is a point that actually DeVos makes in one of our sources.
Okay.
And I think it's a really helpful analogy.
Okay.
It's like you're deciding, are you building a skyscraper?
Okay.
Are you building a house? Are you building a factory?
A factory.
That initial decision shapes everything that follows.
Totally.
What materials you need. The methods you're going to use to build it.
The foundation.
The foundation, the structure, everything.
Okay.
And so I think that's a really helpful way to think about research design.
Yeah, that makes it a lot more concrete for me.
Yeah, and I think the primary aim
Okay.
of having a research design is to make sure that your chosen methods and the data that you're going to collect and just the overall structure of the research is actually going to allow you to answer your research question effectively.
Right. So you don't want to end up with all this data that's useless.
Exactly. It's about being really strategic from the outset.
Right. Okay. So this is a lot more than just saying, am I going to do a survey or am I going to do interviews?
Yeah, that's the common misunderstanding.
Yeah.
People think research design is just choosing your methods.
Yeah.
but it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
So you're right. Those are the specific research methods, interview, surveys, experiments, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But the design is what dictates how and when you use those methods.
Right. So it's like the overarching strategy.
Exactly. It's the strategy guiding the tactics.
Okay.
And Bell and his co-authors talk about this in our sources.
Okay.
And they identify 4 key dimensions that different research designs prioritize.
Okay. This is interesting.
So the first one is establishing causal relationships.
Okay. Cause and effect.
Yeah. So is there a cause and effect relationship between the things you're studying?
Got it.
The second one is generalizing findings to larger populations.
Okay.
And that's what we call external validity.
External validity. Okay.
So how well your study findings apply to a broader group.
Right. So it's not just this very narrow, specific group.
Exactly.
What's number 3?
Number 3 is understanding behavior in specific social contexts.
Okay.
So really looking at the context in which things are happening.
Got it.
And then the fourth one is a temporal appreciation.
Temporal. Okay. So like time.
Exactly how things change over time.
Okay. So these are the things that different research designs are going to prioritize.
Precisely. And depending on your research question,
right,
you're going to be more interested in some of these dimensions than others.
Okay, so today we're focusing on 3 main types of research designs.
That's right.
Cross-sectional, longitudinal, and case study.
Exactly. And I think it's worth noting that we're going to leave experiments for another deep dive.
Yeah, those are a whole other pan of worms.
They are. We could talk about experiments for hours.
Yeah, maybe we'll do that another time.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's start with cross-sectional designs.
Okay, sounds good.
What is that in a nutshell?
So the fundamental idea behind cross-sectional research is that you're capturing data at a single point in time.
Okay.
So it's like a snapshot.
Like a snapshot, yeah.
You're just getting a glimpse of what's happening at that one moment.
Got it.
And so this is really effective for seeing broad patterns.
Okay.
And identifying correlation.
Correlations, right? So like how 2 things are related.
Exactly. Yeah. So for example, you might find a correlation between education level and salary.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Right, so you might find that on average, people with higher levels of education tend to earn higher salaries.
Right.
Now, that doesn't tell you why that relationship exists.
Right.
It just tells you that there is a relationship.
Okay.
And it's important to remember that with cross-sectional designs, you're not really looking at individual choices or how things change over time.
Okay.
You're just getting that one snapshot.
Right. So it's like you're taking a picture of a group of people.
Exactly.
And you can see who's tall and who's short.
Yeah.
But you don't know how tall they were last year.
Right. You don't know if they're still growing.
Exactly. Yeah.
You just know what they look like at this moment.
Okay.
And one of our sources uses this great analogy of an Excel spreadsheet.
Okay.
And I think that's really helpful for visualizing this.
Okay. I like this.
So imagine you have an Excel sheet.
Okay.
And each row represents a different participant.
Okay. So like a person.
Yeah. A person or an organization.
Okay.
And then each column represents a different variable.
Variable, right? So like the things we're measuring.
Exactly. So things like education level.
Okay.
Salary experience. Job satisfaction industry.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
Yeah.
And each cell in that spreadsheet contained the data that you collected at that one point in time.
At that single point in time.
Exactly. So you're just getting one data point for each person for each variable.
Okay. That makes sense.
Now, one thing that can be a little confusing is that even if the data collection takes place over a period of time, it's still considered cross-sectional if you're only analyzing one final data point per participant.
Okay. So, for example, if you track someone's exercise habits for a month, but you're only looking at their average activity level for that whole month, that's still cross-sectional?
It's still cross-sectional because you're only using that one average data point for your analysis.
Okay, that makes sense.
And importantly, with cross-sectional research, you don't always have to collect the data yourself.
Oh, okay.
You can analyze existing data sets.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah, so there are a lot of publicly available data sets that you can use for cross-sectional research.
Okay, so you don't always have to go out and do a big survey.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Sometimes the data is already out there.
That's really useful.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the pros and cons of this single snapshot approach?
Good question. So let's start with the potential advantages. Bergenholtz points out that if you design your study carefully and you have a large enough sample size and you control for other factors that might be influencing the relationship you're interested in.
Right, those confounding variables we talked about.
Exactly, those confounding variables. Then a cross-sectional study can suggest a causal link.
Okay. So it can suggest it.
It can suggest it.
But it can't prove it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a really important distinction.
Okay.
Because correlation does not equal causation.
Right. We hear that all the time.
We do, and for good reason.
Yeah.
Because just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes the other.
Right.
There could be other factors at play.
Got it.
And that actually leads us into one of the major drawbacks of cross-sectional designs.
Okay.
And that's the risk of omitted variable bias.
Omitted variable bias.
Which is a mouthful.
It is a bit of a mouthful.
But basically, it means that there are unmeasured factors that are actually driving the relationships that you're observing.
Okay, so things that you haven't even thought to measure.
Exactly, or things that are just really difficult to measure.
Right.
And so this can really distort your findings.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Yeah, so let's go back to that example of exercise and mood.
Okay.
So you might find a correlation between exercise and mood in a cross-sectional study.
Right.
But you haven't controlled for things like genetics.
Oh, right, genetics, yeah.
Or maybe you haven't considered the possibility of reverse causality.
Reverse causality, what's that?
That means that instead of exercise causing a better mood, it's actually a better mood that's causing people to exercise more.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this is a point that Essiger makes in one of our sources.
Okay.
So just with that single snapshot, you can't really disentangle.
You can't tell what's causing what.
Exactly. You don't know which came first.
Okay.
So because of this risk of omitted variable bias, cross-sectional designs typically prioritize external validity.
External validity.
Over internal validity.
Okay, remind me what those are again.
Sure. So external validity is the extent to which you can generalize your findings.
Right, to a broader population.
To a broader population, exactly.
Okay.
And internal validity is how much confidence you have in the causal relationships within your data set.
Okay, so it's like external is how much you can apply it to the world.
Exactly.
And internal is how much you can trust what's happening in your specific study.
Precisely. And with cross-sectional designs, you're often sacrificing a bit of internal validity for the sake of external validity.
Okay, so you're saying that with cross-sectional research?
Yeah.
We're kind of assuming that knowledge in social science is built by finding these really broad, generalizable trends.
Exactly.
Rather than by deeply analyzing very specific situations.
That's a really good way to put it.
Okay.
It's about identifying those patterns that hold true across many different cases.
Got it. Okay, so that's our snapshot.
That's the snapshot.
Now let's move on to something a bit more dynamic. Longitudinal designs.
Longitudinal designs, yeah. So as you said, these are a bit more dynamic.
Right.
Because instead of just taking a snapshot, we're looking at how things unfold over time.
Okay, so how did they do that?
So longitudinal designs involve collecting data from the same entities at multiple points in time.
Okay, so you're following them over time.
Exactly. We're tracking them.
Okay.
And those entities could be individuals.
Individuals, right.
And it could be groups.
Okay.
They could be organizations.
Right. Different levels.
Exactly. So instead of that one snapshot,
yeah,
we're essentially creating a time-lapse video.
Okay.
We're seeing how things change and develop over an extended period.
And within longitudinal designs, there are two main types, right?
You got it.
Panel studies and cohort studies?
Precisely. So let's unpack those a little bit.
Okay, good idea.
Panel studies follow the same participants repeatedly over time.
Okay, so it's the same people.
Same people.
Every time.
Every time. So you're tracking changes at the individual level.
Okay.
So, for example, you might track the exercise habits and mood of the same 100 employees over the course of a year.
Okay.
And even if some of those employees leave the company or drop out of the study.
Yeah, people drop out of studies.
They do.
Yeah.
It happens. It's a problem.
It is a problem.
But you're still focusing on those individuals.
You're following them.
Exactly. You're following them as long as you can.
Okay, so that's panel.
That's panel.
What about cohort?
So cohort studies are a little different.
Okay.
They track a group of people who share a common characteristic.
Okay.
So, for example, it could be everyone who was hired by a company in the year 2020.
Okay.
So you're tracking that cohort of 2020 hires.
Right.
But at each data collection point, you might survey different individuals from that cohort.
Oh, so it's not necessarily the same people?
Not necessarily the same people. You're still interested in the group as a whole. But you might not be able to follow every single person.
Right, because some might have left the company.
Exactly. Or they might just not want to participate anymore.
Right.
So the focus here is on those group-level trends.
Okay, so like how is the 2020 cohort doing?
Exactly. Are they getting promoted? Are they staying with the company?
Interesting. Okay, so it's more about the big picture.
Yeah, it's a broader view
than the individual stories.
That's right.
Okay, so with longitudinal research, we're in a much better position to look at causality and how things change over time.
Exactly, because we're actually observing those changes.
Yeah.
We're not just inferring them from a single snapshot.
Okay, so how does that work in terms of causality?
So by observing the sequence of events, we can gather much stronger evidence for causality.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. So let's go back to our exercise and mood example.
Okay.
If we observe that increased exercise consistently precedes an improvement in mood across multiple time points for the same individuals, that gives us a much stronger indication that there's a causal relationship.
Right. It's not just a coincidence.
Exactly. It's not just a correlation at a single point in time.
Right.
We're seeing that pattern over time.
Got it.
And our material actually has a helpful table.
Okay.
It's table 2.
Okay.
And it illustrates this concept of having multiple data points for each individual.
So you can actually see how things change.
Exactly. You can see the progression. And now, it's important to remember that even with longitudinal data, causality isn't always a slam dunk.
Right.
There can still be things that trip us up.
Okay, like what?
So, for example, there might be delays in how we measure things.
Okay.
Or there could be unmeasured factors that are influencing both of our variables.
Like those confounding variables.
Exactly.
Okay.
So going back to our exercise and mood example,
okay,
maybe the company introduces a wellness program that encourages both exercise and better stress management techniques.
Okay, yeah.
And so it's possible that it's actually the reduced stress that's improving mood.
Right.
Rather than the exercise alone.
So it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
Exactly. There could be multiple things happening at the same time.
Okay.
So even though longitudinal designs prioritize internal validity. By establishing those temporal sequences.
Right. So you're showing that the change in the independent variable comes before the change in the dependent variable.
Exactly.
Okay.
They often focus on specific populations.
Okay.
And they might have smaller sample sizes.
Right, which can limit how much you can generalize.
Exactly. And as we talked about before, they're not immune to omitted variable bias.
Right. There could still be things you haven't considered.
Absolutely.
Okay, so beyond those general challenges, are there any specific challenges?
Yes, there are some unique methodological challenges.
Okay, what are those?
That come with studying things over a longer period of time.
Okay, let's hear them.
So one of the big ones is time-related effects.
Time-related effects, okay.
So these are natural developments or shifts in the broader social context.
Right, the world is changing around you.
Exactly. The world doesn't stand still.
Yeah.
And those changes can influence your results.
Right.
Independently of the specific factors you're interested in.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. So let's say you're studying the impact of on-the-job training on employee performance.
Okay.
Now, you might find that employees who receive the training perform better.
Right.
But some of that improvement might actually be due to the general work experience they've gained over that same time period.
Right. They're learning other stuff.
Exactly. They're learning other things. They're getting more comfortable in their roles.
Right. So you can't necessarily say it was all because of the training.
Precisely. It's hard to disentangle those effects.
Okay, what's another challenge?
Another challenge is changing social contexts.
Okay, so like cultural norms?
Exactly. So cultural norms can change over time.
Right.
And that can affect how people respond to survey questions, for example.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So what might have been considered a socially acceptable answer 5 years ago might not be considered acceptable today.
Right. Or people might interpret the questions differently.
Exactly. So that can really skew your findings.
Okay, and what's the last challenge?
So the last challenge is attrition bias.
Attrition bias, okay.
And that refers to the fact that people who drop out of a long-term study might be systematically different from those who remain.
Right.
And so that can bias your findings.
Okay, in what way?
So for example, let's say you're doing a longitudinal study on job satisfaction.
Okay.
It's possible that the employees who are the least satisfied are the ones who are most likely to leave the company.
Right.
And therefore, they're going to drop out of your study.
Right. They're not there anymore.
Exactly. And so if you're only left with the employees who are more satisfied, your findings are going to be skewed.
Right. You're not getting the full picture.
Exactly. You're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Okay. So longitudinal research is great because it gives you that more dynamic perspective.
It does, yeah.
It acknowledges that people and societies are always changing.
They are.
It's essential for understanding how things develop.
Absolutely.
And for getting closer to those cause and effect relationships.
Yeah, it's a powerful tool.
Okay, so we've done snapshots, we've done time-lapse videos.
Right.
Now let's switch gears completely.
Okay.
And talk about case study designs.
Case studies, these are a different beast altogether.
They are, yeah.
So case studies involve this really deep exploration of a specific bounded system.
A bounded system. Okay.
So this could be a single organization, a particular event, an individual, or even a specific process.
Right, so it's very focused.
Extremely focused.
Okay.
And the goal here isn't to identify averages.
Right. Or general trends across a large group, like we were doing with cross-sectional. Exactly. Cross-sectional is all about those broad patterns.
Yeah.
Case studies are the opposite.
Okay.
We're trying to understand the really nuanced dynamics and unique characteristics within that specific subject that we're studying.
Right, so it's like zooming in with a microscope.
Exactly. It's getting really granular.
Okay.
And going back to those 4 dimensions we talked about earlier.
All right, cause and effect.
Yes, cause and effect, generalization, context, and time.
Yeah.
Case studies are really primarily focused on understanding behavior and its meaning.
Okay.
In a specific social context.
So it's all about context.
Context is key.
Okay.
Because we're acknowledging that behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right. It's influenced by the environment.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we're really trying to understand how all those different factors in the environment are shaping the behavior that we're observing.
Okay. So can you give me an example? Sure. So let's say we're interested in the challenges that organizations face when they're implementing a chatbot. In their customer service department.
Chatbots, yeah. Everyone's talking about those.
They are very popular right now.
Yeah.
So we might do a case study of a specific company that's going through this process.
Okay.
And we would look at their specific organizational culture.
Okay.
The existing skills of their employees.
Right.
Their current workflows. All of those unique elements within that one company that might influence why the implementation is successful or why it's facing difficulties.
Right. So you're looking at all those interconnected pieces.
Exactly. We're trying to understand the whole system.
Okay. So the questions you're asking in a case study are very different from the questions.
Yeah, they're very different.
You're asking in cross-sectional research.
Right. So in cross-sectional research, we're looking for those general statistical patterns.
Right. Like averages.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we might ask something like, what's the correlation between job satisfaction and productivity?
Right.
Across the entire technology industry. Okay.
A big, broad question.
A big, broad question.
Yeah.
But in a case study, we're asking much more in-depth, context-specific questions.
Okay.
So we might ask something like, how do organizational culture and employee attitudes shape the adoption of chatbots in this particular customer service company?
Right. So you're not trying to generalize to the whole industry?
Not at all.
Okay.
We're really interested in that specific company.
Got it.
And what's happening in their unique context.
Okay, so it's about depth.
Depth.
Context. Meaning rather than broad statistical patterns.
Precisely. It's a different kind of knowledge.
Okay. And you also mentioned the idea of multiple case studies.
Yes. Multiple case studies.
How does that work?
So with multiple case studies, you're basically doing several in-depth investigations in different contexts.
Okay, so you're doing multiple deep dives.
Exactly, multiple deep dives.
Yeah.
And then you're comparing the findings across those cases.
Okay.
Now, you don't select these cases because they're statistically representative of a larger population.
Okay.
You select them because they can highlight interesting theoretical differences or similarities that are relevant to your research question.